Good afternoon, SEU 540 students, teacher candidates. This is Dr. Pabon with a video to go alongside your work on lesson planning. So really, I'm going to walk you through the resources that are provided on D2L and build upon the work that we began in class on last Wednesday. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, and here is my screen. So what I did was go to content, right, as usual, and then I went to lesson plan resources. So first, just a basic overview of the assignment. I'm sure you all have read this, and we've talked about it in class a bit this week. So just in terms of the breakdown, you'll first work on your lesson drafts, and those are lessons 2 through 5. Know that there's not an expectation at all for perfection. What we're doing is practicing, right? You'll then do some revisions on those lesson plans based on my feedback. Then I would come back and work on the introduction and rationale, and I'll say more about that in a few minutes. And then you'll put all your material together, and then you'll be uploading this material onto D2L. So just to clarify that lesson planning here is composed of many decisions, and we spend a lot of time thinking about our instructional decisions way before the lesson plan begins. And so as I talked about in class the other day, that the best way to approach lesson plan is actually thinking about unit designs. And of course, I know that folks have started some work and weren't necessarily thinking about how those lesson plans have some cohesion. So this is the opportunity between now and your revision to think about how you can find a common thread and then develop your guidelines and your understandings, and your essential questions. Your written lesson plan is evidence of your thinking. So it is really important, particularly as new teachers or developing teachers who are earning certification, to be very, very explicit in their lesson plan. I can't underscore that enough, and you'll see some examples of what I mean by explicit in terms of the exemplars that are in the other section. I've stated before that content area teachers are also teacher literacy teachers, and some of the expectations include helping students learn vocabulary, supporting students in constructing meaning from the range of texts, helping students make connections across the text, and then also performing well on classroom and state mandated exams. So in terms of the purpose of writing your lesson plan, it again is strengthening the mental process. So right now, I know it takes a long time to construct a lesson plan, and you may even have had a different template last semester to work from. This is the plan that you are expected to use in your student teaching supervision because it contains all the components that align with the Danielson model and the expectations, particularly for accommodations, modifications, and assessment that are required. So here are some of the course lesson plan objectives, learning objectives that are universally derived from the literacy standards. So you see a list there: present in writing and or speaking knowledge of specific strategies to promote vocabulary acquisition. So notice how that's an understanding and not a guiding question, that would be in teacher speak. Just moving down. I'm asking you to design actually 4 lesson plans, so that's a little error. I'll fix that right now. Um, and so the lesson plans should draw from literacy practices that are within your text. So some of those include disciplinary reading, classroom talk, questioning strategies, genre writing, engaging with new media. These lesson plans don't need to be consecutive, but they should all have a common thread. And my strong suggestion for all of you is that common thread be the central text that you've utilized for your book club, just in the interest of time, and additional supporting text that you would use in your content area, specifically for math, social studies, and science teachers. So your first step is actually identifying the standards. You start there, rather than creating a lesson plan and trying to fit standards. So if you come down, and I'm scrolling down here, you see the core standards for English, math, science, technology, and history, uh, his, um, history, excuse me, and world languages. Um, as I mentioned in class before, you might notice as you read through those documents that they are imperfect. They are works in progress, by the folks that create these standards. Standards are derived from federal mandates and state mandates. And I think that over time, they will be revised again, but this is what we have to work with right now. Those are different from what you'll see on task stream. So these are full documents. You'll see that um, they're substantive. So you have a lot to work with. And my suggestion is to pick a grade and stick with that grade and look across that the material for that particular grade. So your lesson plan is going to include your standards, your learning outcomes, what instructional material you're going to use, what prerequisite skills that students need to have in order to engage in the lesson, and then the implementation. And I cannot underscore enough that you need to be scripting out the actual words that you would be stating to transition through this lesson. Again, this is a piece of arduous work, but saying I'm going to tell students to do this or saying then we're going to do this is not sufficient to really develop at this stage in your development as teachers, um, to explicate and to fully think about what you're going to do in a plan. So that needs to be well thought out, and it is connected to, again, to your teacher identity, and how you're going to approach what it is that you'll be saying to students. So I want you to think about those parts carefully. You can connect these sections with your activities that you fleshed out in your urban education course. So I've asked you to script out those activities and those strategies. Well, those are embedded in your introduction, because there are protocols and guidelines for how to do guided practice, right? And how to transition into guided practice, how to talk to students about working together in independent work. So as you work in that text, you'll see how-to strategies and continue to develop your activities collaboratively. And so you don't have to necessarily reinvent the wheel with this. There are existing ways that you can help students by articulating exactly how you're working as a community in the classroom, explaining, specifying, thinking ahead to the tensions that might emerge, thinking ahead to where you might need to move in the room in order to best support students. You need a closing statement at the end of your lesson. The closing statement is not just the homework that we have tomorrow is. your closing statement is going to align with your introduction. So it should be relevant to what the learning objectives were for today. And that could be connected to an exit survey. It could be connected to a few students sharing out. One of the things to consider when students share out is that those students know for sure and have an understanding of what the material was for the day. So that would involve a check-in with a student or a group of students who can help you facilitate that closure, but make sure that they're saying the right thing. Your accommodations and differentiation. You should be drawing heavily from your coursework with Dr. Muzetta and your coursework over the winter session in special education. But I have also included an accommodations guideline. This is really connected to the Keystone exams, but you can draw from some of these to help you explain what accommodations are, we forgot, and then what some of those look like. Now, again, those are for testing, but you can draw from these in order to develop the set of accommodations that are based on your classroom group, and that document is there as well. You're going to get my feedback. Oh, excuse me. Last thing, you need to have your plan for formative and summative assessment. Your summative assessment can be across the entire unit, but what's your formative assessment for this lesson plan? How are you checking for understanding to make sure the students grasp the material? So what is that going to look like in specificity? What document are you going to use? And just speaking of documents, whatever part of the text or texts that you use for a lesson, those should be included in an appendix. Your upload, your lessons, except the draft number 1, which you've already done, and your revised lesson as per the due dates, and all, that's all in D2L. Then coming back to the introduction, you'll share about your content area, the context where you'll be teaching. Here's where you come back to the big themes in your lesson plan, the text that you utilized, the insights that you've learned about teaching in your content area, and any other information that you find relevant. So just think about this section in terms of big themes. Going back to the essential, the understandings and the essential questions or learning objectives in that lesson. So one additional document that I posted for you that can help some people think about direct instruction. And as many of you wrote in your reflection, both of the models that are listed in the text are very similar in nature, but this visual guide may be helpful for you to think about the flow of your lesson and what each part of the lesson is, the purpose for each part of your lesson. So that's just an image to help you all out. Here again, you have your standards for your your content areas. So those are your major resources, and the template here is again, I think many of you have looked at it already, and is the template that you're expected to use in your student teaching. So I'm just going to go down to week 11 and share with you your sample classroom so that you make sure that you see it. This is representative of actually a urban, a rural, or a suburban classroom. So it's modeled after my own observations in those contexts, even though I know you'll be working in an urban context. So the number of African American, Latinx, and Asian American students is probably going to be higher. In this classroom, you have a student with vision impairment that probably has a paraprofessional. You'll have a student with physical limitations, again, who has a paraprofessional. You could potentially have a student with autism is on the autism spectrum disorder, again with an IEP, maybe does not have um, a paraprofessional to work with, and then a student with disabilities. And you can make a decision about what those are, or have each lesson plan provide a different, include a student with a different type of learning disability. You also have students who are emergent bilingual students. So again, you should be drawing from your work in Dr. Muzetta's class to include accommodations for those students. And then you have some contexts that are relevant to what we're learning in the urban education course, right? So students who are, particularly right now, right, are facing food insecurity, housing instability. One of the some recent data has just shown that some students are experiencing abuse, in particular right now, because they are in the homes of their abuser, unfortunately. So those are some factors to consider in terms of diversity. Now, for each for each content area, I provided some lesson plans in reading, writing, speaking, listening, and viewing. So those are 3 domains for lesson planning, and you can choose one additional one or repetition of one of these. So these have been produced by former students, and these are after they've done their revisions. So your first round may not look like this. These are after I provided extensive feedback. Some of the things that students often miss on the first time are accommodations and modifications, the alignment of the lesson plan from beginning to end, the scripting of their lesson plan, really explaining out what they're going to do, and uh, the consistency in terms of the activities. So going back to the protocols and guidelines to get students to transition, to engage and transition into from one part of the lesson to the other. Students also maybe include too many standards, or too many learning objectives, or not enough standards, or not enough learning objectives, and not necessarily utilizing the material on the other site from Pennsylvania Department of Education. So that's some of the gaps that I've seen before, and you'll notice that those are mostly included here. This is not to suggest that these are all absolutely perfect. You may find some areas that have room for improvement. Excuse me. However, these lessons that I have provided are lessons that ultimately after the revisions were received an A grade, and were lessons also that those students went on to draw from in their student teaching, because I did supervise all of the students uh, from this group, and I saw personally how they were implementing parts of these lessons. Maybe they couldn't do all of this because they did have to work with a classroom teacher educator, but they were able to draw from these lessons. And furthermore, I conducted a survey of those students during student teaching, and they, across the board, shared how this practice work best prepared them for being in the classroom, right? So they had a strong foundation. The last thing I'll share about is, or the second to last thing, is your lesson plan rubric. So someone mentioned last week that we're drawing from a constructivist framework in terms of lesson planning. So we're thinking about learner-centered practices and learner-centered teacher actions. So original thinking, involvement, interaction, connections, questioning, content, subject matter, models, and material are important, and you're going to be evaluated based on your usage, based on the demonstration of these domains. So this is one way that you can sort of check ahead and look at your lesson plan. You can work together to share, particularly in the same content area, to help you uh, have some conversations with one another. Sorry, this is probably my delivery. Um, have some conversations with one another about where some of these components could stand some development. Again, we're thinking about progress, not perfection. So it's okay to have these areas needing development. The point is to produce your lesson plans and to work to the best of your capability, particularly in this moment. All right, so one more thing that I'll share. So we are not going to have synchronous class on next Wednesday, and I am making a change to your due date. So your assignments, the lesson plan, and your class discussion piece is still due on March 18th, next Wednesday. I'm sorry, not next Wednesday. Let me double check this. Give me 1 second, actually. Sorry about that. Let me go back to screen share. I had the correct starting date, but I did make a change to the due date. So we're not going to have synchronous class on Wednesday. You can use the time to work on your lesson plans, reading chapter 3 of Complex Text Decoded. If you start with a reading plan, this chapter will be very helpful in terms of developing that reading plan. So the due date for all of this work, it will be 11:59 p.m. So you'll have the day, and then we won't be meeting in person. So I hope that that is helpful. I hope that the video has provided some explanation in terms of how to develop your first draft of these lesson plans. And just note again, we are not meeting synchronously on Wednesday. You will have the time, the day to work on your plans, and you'll just submit those. If you go to assignments, last thing, drafts 2 through 5 should all go in this box. Okay, so April 1st, that was correct. And then I'll correct the date actually here so that it reflects the correct time, 11:59 p.m. on the 1st. You'll make your best effort. I'm absolutely considering the circumstances that everyone is in right now. So just make sure you get that work in so that you can get the feedback. That's probably the most important part. So that you develop some ways to strengthen your work over time. Okay, so I hope this again has been helpful, and I will see you and be interacting with you virtually. Take care.